Good morning. Today I'd like to start our study off by going to Daniel chapter 9, and I want to read from verse 23. You will recall that Daniel has just had this vision of Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, where he saw that the sanctuary was going to be trampled on for a period of 2,300 years. This is so important to understand here, that the sanctuary meant everything, not only to the Jewish nation or to Daniel, but to mankind. It was through the sanctuary that God was going to reveal what was going to happen. So the trampling of the sanctuary was very important, that we need to understand what's going on there. And then he starts off by saying to Daniel in verse 23, therefore consider the message and understand the vision. So he's saying to him, Daniel, I want you to understand what this is all about. Dear friends, we are told in Matthew 24, Jesus says that when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. You see, we are drawn to understand what is really going on in the book of Daniel. Now you will see that how we are drawn to the first phase of this 2,300 year period. The first phase being for the Jewish dispensation of time, 490 years. We found that as we look at this period, our attention was drawn to two focal points. First of all, the restoration and rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. Now we see that this has taken place. And there's more information regarding this that, as I said to you, we're going to talk about later on. Yesterday's study, we found out that in the final 7 years, Christ, according to Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, and we found certain parts in verse 27, 3.5 years into the final 7 years, Christ was to die for the salvation of mankind. Now, I want you to remember that this is all part of a covenant agreement that God had established with man right in the beginning. In Genesis chapter 3 verse 15, God said to mankind, Adam and Eve, that I will put enmity in the heart of man. And then his whole objective was to restore man back to his original state. How God was going to do this is told to us here in Daniel chapter 9 verse 24 through to 27. So we see part of the plan was that Christ came and took the place of Adam and represented mankind and died for sins. This we see very clear. He became the last Adam, the one that would restore us back to our relationship with the Father in heaven. But it doesn't stop there. I want you to notice in verse 27 that we saw, it says there, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. So our attention is drawn to this understanding of the covenant that was introduced in the Garden of Eden. What was this covenant all about? In order to understand this covenant better, I want you to go to the book of Hebrews. Now, the book of Hebrews is not found in the Old Testament, but in the New. And in chapter 8, Paul writes to us about a very interesting experience that took place with the Jewish nation and God's people. He says there in verse 8, but God found fault with the people and said, the time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judea. Here I want to draw your attention to the fact that Israel has been split up into two sections. Israel, the 10 tribes of the north, and the 2 tribes remaining in the south, Judea. He says, this is the covenant I will make with the whole house of Israel and with the house of Judea. Verse 9, it will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant and turned away from them, declared the Lord. You see, it's interesting that God had tried to get mankind to be restored to him in so many different ways by introducing sacrificial systems, by introducing services which if they understood and actually followed, would have saved them. But they failed to do that. They failed to understand that God was trying to save mankind. So God comes along and he says, I cannot rely on the faithfulness of man. And so he sends his son to become a man. He's born in a manger. He's our son. He's given our flesh, and our sins are placed on him. He becomes the representation of mankind before the Father. And he comes to be faithful. It says, interestingly there in verse 10, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. After this time of rebellion, he says, during this time, I'm going to do something. He says this, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. You see, here we get this impression or distinct understanding that God says, no longer will you rebel against me, for I will have written my law on your heart and on your mind. You will be doing it. You'll be doing it naturally. It actually says further in verse 11, no longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because we will all know him, for from the least of them to the greatest. Then he says in verse 12, part of the covenant agreement, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. You see, it's so interesting that Jesus came, he became Adam, he became the last Adam, he stood in Adam's shoes. Where Adam fell, Christ was victorious, and he died for our sins so that we could be forgiven. It's wonderful when we look at this, that the covenant is confirmed in this last 7-year period. Confirmed first of all with the Jewish nation. This I want you to understand. And then he confirms it later on with all of us. So God is trying to get not only the Jewish nation, but he's trying to get us back into harmony with God. He wants to restore our planet. He wants to remove sin. He wants to restore us back to God's kingdom. Dear friends, when you gave your heart to Jesus, this is what God did for you. Old things were passed away. All things were made new. And this was made possible by what was happening in these final years. Christ died for our sins so that we could be forgiven. And in this period of time, by taking on human form, he kept what mankind was not doing. He was faithful to the covenant agreement with the Father. And now makes us faithful. May God help us to understand this more as we look further into what's happening in these last 7 years. God bless you today.